episode where we're going to talk about the history of barns, and then we'll get into our panelists that'll go through the champs and foes. Hometown History is a video series that started 2.5 years ago with Dami and I just kind of in backyards talking about history. And the whole goal is because we want the next generation of people to find history interesting and be interested in it. I think the youngest person in the room, if I had to guess, is probably my son in the back corner. He's about 9 months old, so the goal is to get kids like that into history. I used to be a high school history teacher. Now I work for a nonprofit downtown called the York County Safety Collab. Jim McClure and I run a website called Witnessing York, and I have a local history website called Wondering in York County. And I am the Third Circuit Court of Appeals librarian in Harrisburg. I'm a Civil War reenactor in my free time, and I run Preserving the History of Newburytown Facebook group. So Dami and I kind of cheated. When you think of a champ and a foe, you were probably thinking of a person. Well, instead of a person, our champ is going to be an action. We consider adaptive reuse, specifically this barn, our champion for tonight. And our foe is going to be an attitude. It's an underappreciation of barns and our agricultural history.
Yeah, so tonight you can tell that we're in a barn, which is what we're going to be talking about. And on your way home tonight, I want you to count how many barns you passed on the way home, because farming was, and in some ways it still is, an essential part of York County history. Barns were the livelihood of the tradition for PA Dutch families, and it housed the livestock, their food, and equipment throughout the entire year. And nowhere else in the world is the bank barn a characteristic of the region's architecture as much as it is in Pennsylvania.
How many of you remember seeing this barn? The barn we're in right now. Yeah. Do you remember going around the corner and seeing, looking at this front? Did you remember when Wyndridge first bought it and they were doing things to it and no one knew what was happening? They're like, what are they doing with that old barn, right? Well, barns like this started in southeast Pennsylvania in the early 1800s. When the English first came here, they actually found the area inhospitable because Pennsylvania summers are actually 10 degrees hotter, and winters here in Pennsylvania are 10 degrees colder than they are in England. And so that's why the English had trouble settling down, because their ways didn't adapt well to the culture that we have here. Guess what country is very similar to York County? Germany. Oh, gold star. Good job. Yes, you guys know. So when the Germans came, they found it very comparable to their homeland, so it was very easy for them to set up shop. Here's another picture of the barn after Wyndridge purchased it and they started renovations. Now compare that barn to these barns. You can appreciate what makes the Pennsylvania bank barn so unique when you look at the roof specifically and the different designs around the country.
So the first thing you'll notice is that it's 2 levels. So the lower level would be where the livestock lived, and it's built into the side of a bank of earth, provided a natural shield against cold weather, but it also stayed cooler in the summers for the animals. And the animals could walk right out onto the bank, into the pasture, and they could defecate on the bottom level, and the lower level was usually built with stone or brick, and the upper level would be logs.
So here's a picture of that upper level. So where we are now, this is where they would have kept the hay and the straw and the grain. Barns, like Ami said, were built on the side of hills or banks, and there you can see if there was a barn that was not built directly in the side of a hill, the Pennsylvania farmers would just make one. They would make a hill. Any guess what they were trying to get into that second floor? It wasn't livestock. Ah, did I hear wagons and equipment? Yes. So they needed something that allowed them to get to that second level, and that's what the bank barn provided. Now the forebay, which is right here, the overhang, that allowed for farmers to be able to just throw out the fodder for the animals, the hay for them to be able to eat it really easily, or the straw. And then that straw, who knows the difference between hay and straw? Some of you, very good. Stay after for a tutoring lesson if you don't know the difference. With the straw, when they would add it to the bedding, they would add it on top of the layers for the animals. So they would defecate and then more layers and defecate, and what that provided, the decomposition of the feces created a heat. If you're familiar with compost, it requires heat, and then that kept the barn warm for the animals, and then an excellent fertilizer for the spring.
And so the banks were also used to assist freedom seekers like Liza and Ezekiel Baptist of Newberrytown, and that was actually our very first hometown history episode, so taking it way back to 2.5 years ago. Just a few days after they moved in, there was a huge snowstorm that hit, and by the mid-18th century, oh, sorry, I was reading the wrong thing. So the farm in the 19th century, and there's two things. The overhanging forebay and the bank are two distinct features of Pennsylvania bank barns. And by the mid-18th century, when the PA Dutch were building these barns, they made the decision to live in modest log cabin dwellings. So that's a testament to the priorities that they had during that time.
So moving forward to today in Wyndridge, I always wondered where they got the name. Like, where did Wyndridge come from? And of course, our very own Jim McClure wrote an article on it, of course. You search up history, and Jim McClure has written an article on it. So in the 1950s, Dr. Philip and Betty Hoover, they purchased the farm, and they built a large house that's about 5 doors down. And just a few days of moving in, there was a very large snowstorm. And that snowstorm was so intense that it blew a lot of the snow up in the ventilation through the strips of the eaves of the attic. And there was so much snow up there, they actually had to get shovels and buckets to remove the snow in your attic. Like, can you imagine the amount of work that must have taken? And so Betty decided to name her house Wyndridge. And so then when it was purchased by the Groffs, they had a nod to that tradition.
So in 1962, the Hoovers bought the 76-acre farm on the curve from Bill Rabb, but the oldest deed goes back all the way to 1815 when Conrad Inner sold it to Ludwig Hartman for just over $2,000, and it stayed in the Hartman family for 95 years, passing to Jacob, to Levi, and then to Emmanuel. And the Hartmans ended up selling it to Jeremiah Snyder, who only owned it for 3 months, and he quickly sold it to Bill Rabb for a profit of $400.
So this farm has, and hopefully always will be, farmed by local farmers. And if you look around, these rafters are a part of the original barn. So thank you to the Groffs for maintaining this heritage. This is something that we're very proud of. So where we're sitting right now, this is where the hay and the straw would have been stored. And then out where the hostess desk is, that was actually a corn crib. You may even remember it if you're from the area, seeing it when you drive past. The Hoover sisters, they had their horses here, and they lived. Is Ben Hoover here tonight, by the way? I'm hoping. I called him, and he helped me with this presentation. So thank you for the Hoovers for giving us the history. But when Philip Hoover died, he was a physician in 1998. They were looking to pass it off to someone who also cared about the land. Enter the Groffs.
Yeah, so the Groffs grew up in Lancaster County, and they're the current owners, and that's basically when they started showing interest. And since he wanted to keep it as a farm, the decision was easy for the Hoovers. Our family is delighted with what the Groffs have done with Wyndridge Farm. Like Philip Hoover, Steve Groff became a doctor, and he specialized in spine and joint surgeries. And unfortunately, he ended up passing away this year, but his legacy is going to live on with this farm, including the barn that he chose to save, and that's why their investment in this farm's adaptive reuse is tonight's champ.
If it wasn't the appreciation for our agricultural history, something like this wouldn't exist. So I'm very thankful for the newly engaged who want to get married and tie the knot in the old barn. It keeps the economic value of something like this alive. I also want to point out that architecture is an amazing way to study our past, because while the Pennsylvania Germans or the original PA Dutch aren't around anymore, so we can't ask them about their stories, we can study buildings. Buildings are relatively immobile, and they stand the test of time during weather, of course. And so it's really neat to be able to look back at history and think about all the things that these rafters have seen, all the hard work that happened in this room, this barn that we're sitting in right now.
But wait, we have to tell you about our foe. So unfortunately, York County is significantly behind in our appreciation of our barns. You can look to Adams County as an example. There's a preservation group in Adams County that regularly updates a barn registry, and it even gives tours of the barns, which we do not do here in York County. And that's why our foe is the unappreciation of our York County barns.
I'm jealous of Adams County. Yes. So this is a little bit of a call to action. So the people in this room, in this barn, if you have in your memory an amazing farm memory, like a something that you had on a farm? Raise your hand. Higher, higher. Okay, I'd say about 50% of you, chances are your kids and grandkids aren't gonna have memories of being on a farm. So we're hoping that after tonight that you can appreciate this adaptive reuse. And if there's business people in here, maybe you can purchase old barns and you can figure out how to renovate them into a different type of venue that can be economically prosperous. Or if you want to start our own York County registry with barns, the first one to document, Wyndridge would be the first place. Yep.